I am the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome to Vampire Reviews. As we all know, vampires wear many hats. Can you help me out? Can you remind me? Have we ever talked here about Dracula? I mean, I don't know, sounds familiar, but has he ever come up? You know, the vampire? Who's Dracula, you ask? Just kidding, you all know who Dracula is. But did you know who he is not? He is not Vlad III, medieval ruler of Wallachia. Better known to us today by his cutesy nickname, Vlad the Impaler. Tepish wasn't his last name. Tepish is just the Romanian word for impaler. Same goes for Dracula. Yes, he was called Vlad Dracula, but it wasn't literally his last name. Dracula means son of Dracul, and Vlad's dad was honored by having the totally bitchin' nickname of Dracul, which translates to dragon, amongst other things. He got it by being a first-class member of the old boys club, the Order of the Dragon, which supposedly did like chivalry and holy knight stuff and nothing sinister or devil worshipy at all whatsoever. Obviously, of course, no one actually thinks real historical person Vlad Tepish was literally a vampire who literally became the literal Dracula that we literally love today. What people think is that Bram Stoker knew about Vlad the Impaler and was like, wouldn't it be cool if? And based his vampire, Dracula, off the guy. But he didn't. The Order of the Dragon had a lot of members, and the cool Dracul nickname got around, and then their sons all got called Draculia. Multiple Draculias running around in old voivode days. According to the nerds who are really obsessed with Bram Stoker and have researched all his notes and life with the finest fanged comb, there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that Bram Stoker had ever even heard of Vlad the Impaler at all. All we know is that he came across the word Dracula while he was reading a book about the history of Wallachia and Moldavia. And then he wrote in his notes, Dracula in Wallachian language means devil. With devil in all caps like that, and probably underlined 14 times and surrounded by bubble hearts. That's how I would write it. And he wasn't wrong. That old Romanian word for dragon can translate now to devil or demon or other similarly associated things. So old Bram just thought it was a badass name. Way cooler than the name he originally had for the character, which was already in development long before he found this name, which was Count Vampire. He crossed that out of his notes and wrote in Dracula instead. You want to know more about this? Go read premier Dracula scholar, Professor Elizabeth Miller's fabulous soapbox/treatise, Dracula, Sense and Nonsense, where she debunks tons of Dracula misconceptions. Elizabeth Miller, what a nerd! Who would ever be that obsessed with vampires? Though she does have an awesome name. So if it's all nonsense, why do so many people nowadays think Bram Stoker based his vampire on Vlad Tepish? Where did this headcanon even start? Well, there is a certain deductive logic to it. Stoker does have Dracula say he commanded nations hundreds of years ago, and we know from his notes he did research the Transylvanian region, geographically at least, where he set Dracula's castle. And in modern pop culture, Vlad the Impaler has gained notoriety as being one of the most evil men in the history of the world. See, he's right there. Yeah, chapter 6. Despite still being considered a national hero in his homeland. But you can imagine the stuffy Western Dracula nerds of yours sitting around their brandy snifters and speculating about this, despite the fact that in Bram Stoker's day, pretty much nobody in England had yet even ever heard of Vlad. We do know that as of 1928, Turkish fans of Dracula definitely had the idea when the unauthorized Turkish rewritten version emerged. And of course, Turkish people would be eager to demonize Vlad III, considering how many of their ancestors his armies slaughtered and impaled. But this version is still just fanfic, and most people have never heard of it either. But one way or another, the headcanon gained enough traction that people the world over started to believe it was, in fact, Bram Stoker's authorial intent. Even Peter Cushing, star of the 1950s Hammer horror Dracula series, took it for granted, as we see in his introduction to the Vampire Stories anthology. Oof, those typos. The mistaken idea, apparently, also appeared in an encyclopedia that a very young Francis Ford Coppola flipped through one day searching for the word Dracula after he got into reading the book as a kid, long before he grew up to become a legendary film director and win all the Oscars for his Godfather movies.
I remember going to the Encyclopedia Britannica as a kid and looked up Dracula and went and saw Vlad the Impaler, and I was like just thrilled to think that it was really a guy.
He goes on to explain that, while he wasn't super into all the cheesy Dracula films he grew up with, the book was his special book. He always had a soft spot for the original book. So when Winona Ryder came to him in 1991 with this new Dracula screenplay she discovered, and she was like, Frank baby, this one's different. This one brings everything back to the book, and you can make this movie and then I can star in it? He was intrigued.
We know what our biggest problem is. Our biggest problem is, why did they go to all this trouble to make that same story again? You've seen all this stuff.
I say new screenplay, but the scriptwriter, James Hart, had actually been trying to get this shot since he wrote it in 1977. And it was already picked up to finally become a TV movie when Winona Ryder found it. But Coppola had bigger ideas, and he took it over. And one of those ideas had a whole lot to do with Vlad the Impaler. This 1992 film, which he called Bram Stoker's Dracula, just because he always likes to include the source author's names in his film titles when he can, was huge. It features an all-star cast, won 3 Oscars, and is totally responsible for cementing the idea in pop culture consciousness that Dracula was literally supposed to be Vlad the Impaler. Thanks, Frank. The movie opens in the 1400s with Gary Oldman as Vlad III coming home from war to find out his Winona Ryder wife, Elisabetta, who has an awesome name, has killed herself, Romeo and Juliet style, because some jerk told her he died. The priests tell him her soul is in hell. And so he flips out and curses God, thereby becoming an immortal undead vampire. If I had known it was that easy to become a vampire, I would have started stabbing crosses ages ago. Am I damned yet? This is from Target. It costs $1.99. Of course, Coppola's film wasn't the first to use this Dracula is literally Vlad idea. It's in that obscure 1974 Dan Curtis British made-for-TV movie, a tiny bit, and a few books nobody remembers. But the idea didn't truly take off until 1992 with Gary Oldman screaming in anachronistic Romanian in his armadillo muscle armor suit. Enough so that the scriptwriter James Hart even takes credit for their film doing it first.
The other reason to do Dracula was to bring for the first time into the Stoker story the true historical Dracula.
Although neither he nor Coppola ever mention it, their film actually shares more than one crucial key element with Dan Curtis's largely forgotten TV movie. All they cite as inspiration are the book canon and their feels. But James Hart did write his screenplay a mere 3 years after the 1974 movie came out, and whether these elements were in his original 1977 draft or added in Coppola's revised 1991 script, I find it hard to believe that at least one of them never watched it. Their movie has the same tragic dead wife backstory and everything. The Vlad the Impaler embellishments weren't all that Coppola added to Hart's script. When I say he took it over, he took it over. He had the film's all-star cast sit down and read the entirety of Stoker's original novel aloud together, which totally my idea of a party, and he asked them all what else they wanted from the book to add into the script. And as a group, they gave it quite the overhaul. Because that was the thing, right? Why tell the Dracula story again when it's been done so many times before? So many times. Especially if you're the freaking godfather himself, Francis Ford Coppola. Well, because he believed that not a single one of the over 200 film versions that existed so far at the time had ever gotten the book right. Like, for one thing, films never show that Dracula starts as an old man with creepy, hairy werewolf palms when Jonathan Harker meets him in Transylvania, then reverse ages to become young and dashing-ish by the time he gets to England to prey upon the pure innocent Lucy and Mina. Yeah, one of the Oscars this film won was for the makeup. We've already gone over the whole Dracula story in my previous videos multiple times, so I'm just gonna sum it up for you as fast as possible this time. Jonathan Harker goes to Transylvania to sell Dracula a house in England and he gets molested by 3 vampire babes. Dracula goes to England to eat Jonathan's girlfriend Mina's best friend Lucy. Lucy becomes a vampire too sexy to be allowed to live, and her 3 boyfriends team up with the quirky old man Dr. Van Helsing to slay her. Dracula goes after Mina next, but the 5 men hunt him down and slay him and his 3 sexy brides, and Mina is saved from becoming sexy herself, and there are no more vampires again, ever. This film does stick pretty close to all the key plot points in the book. Includes almost all the original characters that are so often cut out of other versions, and even incorporates the novel's epistolary format, with letters and diary entries to serve as exposition dumps. Of course, a 2-hour film can never portray a full book exactly, but the filmmakers paid homage to as much as they could, and more importantly, they wanted to make sure the spirit of the book was conveyed in a way that had never been done right before, right? The very essence of Dracula himself. And what was that essence? Well, didn't you know that Dracula is actually a tortured, misunderstood romantic hero? Not a cruel villain. He doesn't want to conquer England with his vampiric scourge, or spread evil, or punish mankind, or any of that stuff. No. All Dracula really wants is love. So lonely, so romantic, so tortured.
The idea was to portray Dracula finally as the charismatic, tragic hero that he really was.
That he really was. And after like 400 years of grieving for his dead wife, she's been reincarnated as none other than Mina. And Dracula's got to go to England to woo her back.
I know you. I have crossed oceans of time to find you.
Gary Oldman says that he took this part because he wanted to know what it would be like to say that line to someone. So romantic.
I have crossed oceans of time to be with you.
You so crazy, you could have just called.
This wasn't the first time we saw a romanticized version of Dracula. Dan Curtis's TV movie totally cribbed its reincarnated lost love plot from his soap opera Dark Shadows, but the much more popular 1979 Dracula film starring Frank Langella is famous for its super sexiness. And, in general, the link between horror and the erotic is a huge part of what the Victorian Gothic genre is all about. But that was just the thing, right? We've discussed all this before in my previous videos. The erotic was horrifying to the repressed people of oldie times. Not truly romantic. But look how Coppola's film was marketed. This sexy poster. And that tagline, "Love never dies." Considering how Phantom of the Opera-y the romance scenes are in this movie, it's no wonder Andrew Lloyd Webber used that same line as the title for his Phantom sequel years later. Ha! And just like Love Never Dies the musical, love definitely does die at the end of this version of Dracula. Except in the right way. Originally, the film left Dracula's death kind of ambiguous, since he so famously regenerates over and over again in so many other versions. But Francis Ford Coppola showed an early screener to his buddy George Lucas, who was like, "No man, you gotta do some reshoots and have Mina chop off his head to make it clear he's dead for good. Otherwise, everyone's gonna assume he'll come back. And his sacrifice of love doesn't mean anything." Because when you have a villainous figure fall in love and that love changes him enough that at the end he's like, "No, object of my love, be free. I love you enough to let you go." And then you bring him back later to repeat his evils. That kind of ruins everything. Andrew Lloyd Webber. Speaking of Phantom of the Opera connections, much like the later film version of Phantom, Coppola's Dracula borrows imagery from Jean Cocteau's grandiosely romantic classic Beauty and the Beast film. Your cry. Look at my hand. Now look back up at me. Your tears are now diamonds.
Our love is stronger than death.
Not that there's anything wrong with romance, especially vampire romance. It's dark and angsty and gothy and tragic and complex, and I love it. And you are allowed to reimagine Dracula any way you want. It's fine. With so many thousands of interpretations of the guy, we can have cruel Draculas, and we can have funny Draculas, and we can have loving Draculas. All the more Draculas, the better. But I will agree that the fact that the filmmakers were so convinced that this tragic romantic angle was what was truest to the essence of Stoker's original novel is baffling.
You are my love and my life always.
None of this is in the book. In its famous scene where Dracula exchanges blood with Mina in bed, she is terrified and repulsed. There is nothing loving or consensual about it. It's erotic horror, but it is definitely horror. In this film, though, she wants it. She wants it bad. She wants it even more than Dracula wants it.
No. Oh, I cannot let this be.
Please, I don't care. Make me.
Marry you because as I am to walk in the shadow of death for all eternity. I love you too much to continue.
Take me away from all this death.
By condemning her to an eternity of murderousness? Okay. You see, Mina in this version is conflicted. I mean, I guess that'll happen when you're someone's long-lost love reincarnated but don't realize it. She knows she's supposed to want to be a good and proper Victorian lady, but her heart's not into it. Secretly, she likes to look at porn and is jealous of her flirty rich friend Lucy's freedom with her sexuality. For Mina, the vampire represents an opportunity to embrace her true sexy nature that she fears society would condemn. To give her some credit, she doesn't throw her life away for sexy vampire love immediately. It takes her a while to get to the point where she's straight up dating Dracula. She even dumps Dracula briefly to go marry Keanu Reeves' Jonathan, but it doesn't last. She literally is Dracula's reincarnated dead wife after all, so of course she has to love him. Even Dracula murdering her best friend isn't enough to turn her off.
You murdered Lucy! I love you. Oh, God, forgive me, I do.
In the end, it's Dracula himself who has to beg her to realize that vampireness is not the answer.
Give me peace.
For him, the oceans of time spanning love they share is enough to overcome his selfish desires. And he finally lets go and accepts the end of his immortality. She respects this choice and is the one to set his soul free. Yeah, you think the filmmakers were Phantom fans? The dark, angsty extravaganza that was Phantom of the Opera was taking America by storm in the early 90s, so Even if the similarities are just coincidence, it's no wonder this movie did so well at the time. Our appetite was so wet back then for this kind of indulgently lush and melodramatic, forbidden yet empowering romance. You see, with Dracula, he's usually interpreted as someone who became a vampire willingly. A vampire who, one way or another, chose his own dark and evil path, which sets him in contrast to the angsty, reluctant vampires that have since kind of taken over the genre. But villains who are just plain evil result in shallow characters and stories. And in most versions of Dracula, he's pretty shallow. The question isn't, why do Dracula again? It's, why do a shallow Dracula again? And this movie doesn't. It keeps Dracula's dark choice, doesn't diminish his evil, just gives him a reason for it, and then allows him to find redemption. He doesn't get forgiveness or justification or a happy ending, just a sympathetic one. And perhaps anyone who's ever made dark choices can look to this vampire as a recovery metaphor. The end of evil is always a good thing, but especially when it comes about by the evildoer's own choice. Of all the versions of Dracula, this film is definitely one of the most unique. And whether you love it or hate it, you can't deny that it is interesting and beautiful to look at. One of the Oscars it won was for the costume design, and a lot of canon snobs hate on the costumes for their anachronisms, but they are gorgeous, especially compared to all the repeating black cape cliché Draculas who came before. Francis Ford Coppola talks about how he originally wanted to use minimal blank sets and have the costumes be the focus of the entire production design, but the studio wouldn't let him do that. So we get awesome sets too. He brought in the Japanese artist Eiko Ishioka, and she took inspiration from the novel's famous opening line.
The impression I had was that we were leaving the West and entering the East.
And incorporated kabuki influence and other culture-crossing elements into her designs. The colors and nature symbolism she used, snakes and flowers and insects, especially expressed the vampire metaphor of embracing sexuality. You see, Mina's wearing green when she meets Dracula because green is the color of horniness. And Mina is so secretly thirsty.
The green fairy who lives in the absence wants your soul.
And not a costume, but when Dracula turns into mist to come into her bed, he's as green as he can get. Fun fact about the special effects in this movie, they were all done entirely with double film exposure and other in-camera techniques. Save for the one exception of this Blue St. Elmo's fire, absolutely nothing was added with computers or done in post-production. And doing the effects this way was really, really hard. Francis Ford Coppola was super proud of that. He tells the story of how his special effects crew told him it was impossible to do all the stuff he wanted without computers, so he fired the whole team and brought on his own son instead to make sure everything was done practically. This was important to him because they were doing Dracula.
I thought that I would not only make the film entirely in a false place, in a studio, but I would only use effects done as they would have been done in 1900.
Because Dracula is a classic, you see. It's the classic of classics when it comes to film adaptations of classic novels, so he only wanted to use classic effects to honor that. And also, keep it artificial, because the vampire is artificial. Unlike other Dracula interpretations obsessed with drawing the metaphor between authenticness, real life, this film embraces the core of the vampire story for its fairy tale quality. The laws of physics don't apply in the vampire's realm. And this practical illusion, the trickery of the film elements themselves, becomes symbolic of the illusions and delusions that vampire stories represent. And I don't mean in the sense that vampires aren't real, but in the sense that the vampire represents a way to challenge social constructs that aren't real. Like Mina here, shedding her belief in the Victorian ideal of repression and propriety to embrace her true self and real sexuality. Like Dracula's disillusionment with his religion that led him to becoming a vampire in the first place. The struggles of and societal stigma against mental illness.
Dr. Jack! I'm no lunatic man, I'm a sane man fighting for soul.
The stigma surrounding venereal disease.
Diseases of Venus, and they are involved in that sex problem about which the ethics and ideals of Christian civilization are concerned.
The parallels of marriage to vampiric enslavement. The debate about what is true science.
There are no limits to science.
How can you call this science? Do you think Madame Curie would invite such comparisons? Really?
The meaningless value society places on youth, with the reverse aging and Jonathan's whitening hair. The endlessly transforming appearance of evil, symbolized by Dracula's countless forms and looks. And the false notion that redemption must involve forgiveness.
I agreed with everybody that would say, why another Dracula?
There were so many of them, but no one ever did the book.
Well, neither did you, Francis. But that's okay. Despite how salty I am about all the Vlad the Impaler stuff, you still made a damn fine vampire movie that was hugely influential, with a killer soundtrack. Because, get it? Kilar wrote the music. I am the Maven of the Eventide, and you know what? Maybe this would work better if... Oh, yes! The pen is mightier than the kitchen knife! Love never dies. Love never falters. Once it has spoken, love is yours. Yeah, I was gonna wear the doofy sunglasses too, but I have more dignity than that. Not that much more dignity, but I have some dignity. Not too much dignity, though, to not remind you to check out the book I wrote. This is The Company of Death, the book I wrote that is available online at any bookseller you can find in print, hardback, and ebook, and there will be an audiobook in the future. It's about the Grim Reaper and zombies and vampires in the apocalypse, so check it out. And of course, thank you to my Patreon patrons. You make vampire reviews possible. If you would like to help me make more vampire reviews, consider joining my Patreon. If you can't, just please like this video, subscribe to my channel, leave me comments for the algorithm. Good night.